If the Bible isn't true, then everything I've said so far is wrong. Not just wrong, but dangerous. Because I'm telling you how to live your life based on it. So before we go any further, we have to answer one question. Is the Bible reliable? Can we actually trust this book? People will say things like, the Bible has changed over time. It's just a collection of ancient stories. It's been rewritten so many times that nobody knows what it originally said. Those are fair questions that need answers. But today, we're not going to rely on opinions. We're going to look at evidence. Think about how this works in the real world. I work in the medical field as an RN. Communication is everything. We're constantly asking, is the information accurate? Was it transmitted correctly? Can we trust the source? Because lives depend on it. Historians do the exact same thing with ancient writings. They ask, was this preserved accurately? Were there reliable witnesses? Can we verify what was written? And when you apply these same standards to the Bible, it doesn't fall apart. It actually stands out. So let's treat this like a case, not a sermon, not a tradition. We're going to look at 6 pieces of evidence. And you can decide for yourself. Exhibit A, manuscripts. When historians look at ancient manuscripts, they look at 2 main things. How many copies exist and how close those copies are to the original. Because the more copies you have, the easier it becomes to detect changes. Let's compare the New Testament to some other ancient writings. Plato, we have about 7 copies, and they were written over 1,000 years later than the original. Tacitus, about 20 copies, and they also were written 1,000 years later than the originals. Herodotus, about 8 copies, written 1,300 years later. Homer's Iliad, about 1,800 copies. The New Testament has over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. If you include other languages, we have over 24,000 copies. And the earliest fragments are within 50 to 100 years of the original writing. That right there makes the New Testament the best preserved ancient document in human history. All historians consider these other documents I mentioned earlier as being reliable, based on a very limited number of manuscripts, and many years between the originals and the copies. The question isn't whether or not this standard works. The question is whether or not we're going to apply it consistently. So if someone says, the Bible's changed over time, they would also have to reject everything we know about ancient history. Exhibit B, timing. Most of what we know about Alexander the Great comes from sources that were written 400 years after the events occurred. Many Roman histories were written 80 to 100 years after the events. Jesus was crucified around 30 AD. Most New Testament books were written between 50 AD and 70 AD. That's 20 to 40 years later. That means eyewitnesses were still alive. This wasn't written in some distant legend era. This was written while people could still challenge it. That brings us to Exhibit C. Again, the Gospels were written within the lifetime of many of the original witnesses. They include real names, people, places, details. They also include embarrassing details. The disciples are shown as being confused and afraid. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. If you're making up a story, you don't write yourself like that. That's honesty. Exhibit D, verification. The existence of Pontius Pilate was once doubted. Then a stone inscription was found. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. The Pool of Bethesda was doubted. It was found, just like it was written, with 5 porticos. Archaeology confirms the Bible again and again and continues to do so. Exhibit E, the Dead Sea Scrolls. For many years, the earliest manuscripts we had of the Old Testament writings were from 1000 AD. That all changed in 1947, when a boy wandered into a cave close to the Dead Sea. He threw a rock into the darkness at the back of the cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. And what he discovered was a lot of scrolls. Ancient manuscripts, many of which dated back to 200 BC. Now what they found when they compared the Dead Sea Scrolls to the manuscripts from 1000 AD was a 95% match. For over 1,000 years, the message had not changed. Exhibit F. The Bible was written by about 40 different authors across 1,500 years of time. Different places, different cultures, yet it tells one story. God created humanity, humanity fell into sin, God provided salvation through Jesus Christ. That level of unity does not happen by accident. Bonus evidence. This is actually really cool, and I didn't hear about it till recently. J. Warner Wallace and Josh McDowell both point out an undesigned coincidence that implicitly shows the harmony of the Gospels. A very particular example of this involves a woman named Joanna. Joanna. Luke 8:3 tells us that she was the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward. She also traveled from time to time with Jesus, the 12 disciples, and other women that traveled with Jesus. Luke 24:10 mentions her as one of the women that discovered the empty tomb of Jesus. Now, when you read the book of John, you notice that John seems to have this insider access to all these conversations that were happening between the higher ups, who's who in the people of Judea. And you begin to wonder, why does he have all of this insider information? Well, the answer is found back in Luke, because Joanna was the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward. She would have had access to a lot of information. I just think it's so cool that this woman that's just mentioned a couple of times in the gospel, and it's just in passing, is actually the one that's supplying them with all this information. It's why they have the inside track of what's happening behind closed doors. I think that is so cool. So what's the verdict? The Bible is reliable. The Bible stands apart from every other ancient book. So the question is not, can we trust the Bible? The question is, if the Bible is true, what are you going to do about it? Do not miss next week. Next week, we are going to answer the question, is Jesus the Son of God? Because if he is, then everything changes. I'll see you next week.